On the Communicators, a discussion with Congressman Bob Goodlatte, chairman of the House Subcommittee on Intellectual Property and co-chair of the Congressional Internet Caucus.
Congressman Bob Goodlatte is chairman of the Subcommittee on Intellectual Property and the Internet, and as well co-chairman of the House Internet Caucus. How do you envision your role in the upcoming or the current 112th Congress when it comes to tech policy?
Well, I think I am very fortunate to chair what I think is one of the best subcommittees in the Congress, and it's particularly good in terms of looking at what we need most in our country right now, and that's job creation and growth of our economy. The tech industry, the tech community plays a huge role in that. A very high percentage of our job growth is related to development of new technology, and a very large percentage of our exports are related to that as well. So promoting that through both intellectual property, which is the jurisdiction over patents, copyrights, and trademarks. And think about the internet is the largest collection of patents, copyrights, and trademarks in the history of the world. And the subcommittee has jurisdiction over antitrust issues or competition policy. So again, promoting competition, I believe, creates jobs. So this subcommittee, I think, is very key in terms of job creation, and that's what we're focused on.
How does your role meld with that of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Greg Walden, Fred Upton, et cetera?
Well, those are great guys. It's a great committee, very important pro-business, pro-job creation committee that also deals with some of the same issues, but from a different standpoint. For example, their jurisdiction over the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Communications Commission is more regulatory focused, whereas the Judiciary Committee generally is more focused on their creation and enforcement of various types of laws, intellectual property laws, antitrust laws, criminal laws, all of which come into play when you talk about the internet.
So when you talk about job creation, has the broadband policy of the last 2 years and its expansion in this nation been good for job creation?
Well, certainly the expansion of broadband and bringing more high-speed internet access to more people is a very good thing. Whether the process by which that's being done with massive spending under the stimulus, all of which has to be borrowed and has, I would argue, a countering effect is good, and whether all of the rules of the road. Remember, when you talk about extending service to the additional homes, primarily in inner cities and out in rural areas, you've got to be very careful that the government isn't subsidizing one player in that at the expense of another that's already making investments from the private sector into the expansion and development of that internet access. It's a historic role for the government, and one that I don't object to. You know, it started with telephony and bringing electricity to rural America, but by the same token, those have always in the past, especially when that service was rolled out, been monopolies. This is a little different dynamic here when you want to promote and you have a number of different competing internet service providers. You've got to be very careful that they are using that money to indeed bring new access to areas where the private sector would not invest, as opposed to leveraging one company that has a base of operations in a more profitable suburban or urban area, and then uses government money to reach out into other sectors of the economy, as opposed to someone else who's already done that and is bringing internet service to a community based upon their business model. So the government involvement here it's like three-dimensional chess, as opposed to the traditional forms that rural utility service and so on did in terms of promoting access to communications in the past.
Well, joining us in our conversation with Representative Bob Goodlatte is Gautam Nagesh of the Hill newspaper.
Representative Goodlatte, you just mentioned the broadband stimulus grants. It's interesting because the president recently unveiled a new national wireless plan in Michigan aimed at doing exactly the same thing, which is expanding broadband coverage. He really focused on rural areas he touted this 98% of Americans figure to be covered by the next generation wireless broadband. Did you have any response to that? Because we know that's going to take some congressional action to get some of those measures through.
Well, I think we should look at it very carefully. I think that oversight hearings should be held certainly in the Energy and Commerce Committee. We might even look at it in our committee based upon not so much our internet jurisdiction or intellectual property jurisdiction, but from that same competition standpoint. Is it being done in such a way that will continue the encouragement of private sector investors to invest in rolling out broadband? Because they have done the most and they have the largest resources available. The government, given its very difficult economic circumstances, where, as you know, we're in the Congress right now trying to close a $1.4 trillion deficit last year. 40% of what the government spent last year was borrowed against our children and grandchildren's future. So taking money out of one pocket to put it into another has to be done in a way that we're being assured that we're not discouraging private investment and that we're not disadvantaging private companies that are also looking to provide those services. That's the key to making sure that a broadband rollout works well, not just for right now and expenditures right now, but in terms of future investment incentives for people to take the risk and put money into rolling out broadband.
In terms of impact on the deficit, does the fact that the administration is proposing to fund these measures through spectrum auctions affect the way you view it, or is it all revenue to you?
Well, I think one has to look at the fact that we have always relied upon spectrum auctions for funds that can be used for a variety of things. So it's all fungible, and therefore if the government is proposing massive new expenditures, that has to be added against the bottom line of the huge deficits that we already have. So not to say that making sure that high-speed internet access isn't a good thing and doesn't involve, particularly in rural areas, some government involvement. I think the whole process and the cost of it deserves a lot of close scrutiny.
Taking the opposing tack, if a private company were to determine that a certain coverage area were not economically feasible to cover, do you see a role in the government in supporting development to those areas? Sure.
That's what the Rural Utility Service, which is, I also serve and have been the chairman of the Agriculture Committee, and that actually happens to be the jurisdiction of that committee. So I've worked on these very issues of fairness for a long time, and as I said, that same Rural Utility Service has been responsible for bringing telephone service and electrification to rural areas. So there is a role, but we need to be careful that we understand the limitations of that role due to the fact that there has been a great deal of investment and rollout of broadband services in rural areas. I represent a district that is one of the more rural areas in the eastern part of the United States, and I can tell you that not only are services being provided in those areas, not always as competitive as you have in a major city, but services being provided, but often they're being provided by some of the smallest telephone companies and ISPs in the country who, you know, suddenly being confronted with a new competitor, either subsidized or in some other way financed by the federal government, is disconcerting to them. And again, that has to be a part of the equation.
So, Congressman Goodlatte, would that call for USF reform at this point? And do you foresee that coming in the 112th Congress?
That's certainly a possibility. That's something that is not basically the jurisdiction of our committee, primarily the Energy and Commerce Committee. But the issue of what is a fair way to finance that is something that certainly ought to be reviewed on a fairly frequent basis, and I suspect that now would be a good time to look at that.
As someone who is former chairman of the Ag Committee and serves on it and represents a rural district, what are your personal thoughts?
Well, I do believe in the important principle that the economic vitality of the entire country is benefited by having our rural areas able to communicate with the world. This is something that is a lot like the railroad in the 19th century, something that in the 19th century was also subsidized by the government, not without a lot of controversy and a lot of fraud and a lot of waste, but nonetheless the Transcontinental Railroad and expansion of railroad into the more remote parts of the country, help to grow the economy of the country. Similarly, today, you do not have to be inside the Beltway or on Wall Street or in some other major urban area to provide certain types of job skills that you used to have in those areas. So this is a competitive issue for rural America. If they can communicate with the rest of the world, they can offer quality of life and jobs that makes them very competitive for people who don't want to live with traffic jams and high crime and so on, and want to move into those rural areas.
One other note on expanding broadband coverage to rural areas. You discussed stimulus broadband grants. I believe that up to $2 billion of the original stimulus broadband grants were slated for the rural utilities service. Have you guys been examining sort of how those were dispersed in addition to
We have, and that's what led to actually even before the stimulus funding, there was earlier efforts to do this during the Bush administration, and that's what led to this discussion about how do you write the rules of the road, under which circumstances are federal funds appropriate and which are not. And of course, there aren't clear guidelines for that, so different administrations have taken different philosophical points of view about what role government should have here. And again, I think that calls for a very close examination of what's being proposed, as well as a close examination of how the funding that was put into the stimulus has been spent.
This is C-SPAN's Communicators program. Our guest this week is Representative Bob Goodlatte, a Republican of Virginia. He is chairman of the Subcommittee on Intellectual Property and the Internet, as well as co-chairman of the Congressional Internet Caucus. Joining us in our conversation, Gautam Nagesh of the Hill newspaper. Next topic area, Mr. Nagesh.
Well, doubling back to intellectual property, you've mentioned that you felt like your committee was more the place where legislation is often written. So are you indicating that you or someone on your committee will be taking the lead on intellectual property or patent reform going into the next session?
You bet. This has been, the chairman of the full committee, Congressman Lamar Smith of Texas, has been working on patent reform for many years, as have I. And he has tasked me with being very fast out of the gate on patent reform. In fact, I left a patent reform hearing to come over and be with you right now. Fortunately, I was able to get my portion of the work done, and then someone else, the vice chairman of the committee, took over to recognize many other members who are there. Lots and lots of interest in this, both in the Congress and in the various sectors of our economy, not just the technology sector, but obviously a very, very keen interest there. We have run into a number of problems in past Congresses in trying to get to the finish line. The House passing legislation that couldn't get through the Senate passing legislation that was not of interest to many of the people who are intellectual property rights advocates. So we're now both in a bipartisan and a bicameral way working very hard to try to find what patent reforms are necessary to enhance job growth in our country and what can get across the finish line so that it actually can be signed into law by the president. And that, I think, focuses first and foremost on the efficiency of the patent office, both in terms of how quickly they can make decisions about patents, because there are increasing backlogs that are very concerning, and about the quality of the patents coming out. Are these really new ideas, new inventions, deserving of the kind of protection that the patent system affords genuine inventors, which gives them an incentive to invest a lot of money in bringing that product through the manufacturing phase and then into the marketplace? Or are they efforts to simply climb on the back of somebody who has done that legitimate work, already has a patent, or is attempting to license somebody else's patent ideas? So trying to find our way through that is very, very important. Fortunately, here in the last several years, the courts have taken a more dynamic, more renewed focus on how the patent system is working, and a number of reforms have effectively taken place through court decisions. So that has helped to narrow the focus on what the Congress actually needs to do, and may make it a little easier for us to pass legislation. So we're holding a hearing today, listening to a number of the stakeholders We will hold another hearing to hear from legal experts as to what the courts have done in recent decisions and how that might guide us. And we've held we've had the Commissioner of the Patent Office come in and talk to us about what he's doing to try to speed up the process and improve the quality. So there'll be a number of contentious issues, and we're going to try to sort through which of those we can find common ground on and which of those need to be left by the wayside because we can't get enough votes to pass through the Congress. The chairman and my determination is to get a bill done and signed into law.
Well, what are some of the differences? Why has it taken years to get to patent reform?
Well, you have basically two different points of view here. You have people, and this is very general because there are probably as many different viewpoints as there are people who hold patents. But basically, the basic confrontations tend to come from people who utilize by license other people's ideas and create a device or software that is very complex and might incorporate hundreds of different patents. And you have people who are inventors and devise a single patent that can be used for a single device or something that only contains a small number of patents. They don't encounter the same problems. If you're building a piece of hardware or software in the technology industry and it's incorporating several hundred different patents, and one of those turns out either legitimately or illegitimately to be the basis of a claim, that can hold up that entire product from coming to the marketplace and make it no longer attractive to invest in bringing it to the marketplace. Obviously, that's a job killer, and we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. On the other hand, if you're the holder of that patent and you believe you have a legitimate claim and you see somebody else utilizing it in their product, you want to make sure that the legal system works to protect you and reward you for somebody else infringing upon what is your property right. If you're in the pharmaceutical industry, you probably have a drug that only has a few patents attached to it, and so the current system works better for you to defend yourself than if you're developing something at Cisco or Intel or a major technology company and you're incorporating hundreds of ideas. And then of course the underlying genius, that individual, whether they work for a large company or whether they're an independent inventor, that's what we want to ultimately reward and make sure that they have the incentive to go on inventing, but also then the incentive to get that invention to the market, that people will take a risk on them, invest in their patent idea, build a business around it, and create jobs. If we can devise a system that improves our current one, which a lot of people think is starting to falter, to lag behind because of the fact that it's become cumbersome, it takes too long to get a patent to market, and then there's too many questions about whether the quality of those patents are good. All of that is what our focus is.
So I did want to ask you, in terms of the administration's recent efforts, they've prioritized intellectual property issues to some degree. The chief Enforcement Coordinator Victoria Espinel released an update to her report. We've seen Immigration and Customs Enforcement seizing domain names, which is a new action that they've taken recently. How have you reacted? Are you satisfied with some of the actions the administration is taking? Have they shown you they're serious about patent?
I think they are serious about patent reform. We had the commissioner in. He has taken a number of aggressive stands, and I think he deserves some credit for looking to modernize the system. I think there is a long way to go, however. The testimony that we've been hearing here in the committee of late focuses on the lack of the use of some of that very technology that's been developed and patented to speed up and make more accurate the review process. So, if you have the opportunity to use technology to deploy how far-reaching your examination of what other ideas are out there to see whether this is a new idea or not, and to accurately compare, and you're not doing that, you're still doing things the old-fashioned way, completely by hand, that slows down the process. Obviously, we need more examiners, but we also need more and better use of technology to speed up that process. Then there are other things. There are legal reforms. There may be some things that we need to do in the courts. As I mentioned, several things related to venue, forum shopping, where people pick a particular court because they always know they rule in favor of the plaintiff and bringing their lawsuit there. The courts have done some good in that area. And in the area of damages, the courts have ordered the judges when the Supreme Court has ordered judges, based upon new standards that they've come forward, to look more carefully at about how they apportion and assign damages in a case where they have found infringement to have taken place. You don't want, with 400 patents in a product, you don't want one item to get so much compensation when there has been infringement found that it makes the whole thing unprofitable. On the other hand, if that one thing is the key idea behind that entire new piece of equipment, then they are obviously deserving of more compensation if they have been infringed on. Very complicated, and again, sometimes the courts are better suited to decide some of these things than the Congress, but we need to look at that and find out where they've gone. There are internal things with regard to, once a patent's been issued, can you go back in and look at what's called post-grant review. An idea goes through the patent system, not a lot of attention being paid to it. The examiner decides, yes, this is a good idea, grants a patent, and then somebody else says, hey, I've already got something that is exactly the same thing. Under what circumstances can they come in and challenge the issuance of that patent after it's already been issued? A lot of examination behind that as well.
One other note on patent reform, Senators Leahy and Hatch have introduced a bipartisan bill in the Senate that has gained a great deal of support. How do you guys view that bill in the House, and is that something that you would use as a framework? Does it prioritize the same topics?
We're going to start from scratch, and we're going to look at what we think there is widespread support and that could pass the House with strong support. But as we do that, we're going to take into account where the Senate is, where they have been, and have some close discussions with both Senator Leahy and Senator Hatch and other senators to make sure that we're not creating a divide here that can't be closed. We don't want to start with the Senate bill, not at all, but we do want to take into account what we think is achievable in the Senate and what is achievable in conference between the Senate and the House.
Congressman Goodlatte, what about the theft and bootlegging of intellectual property? Do you see action in the 112th coming forward? And if so, how do you see that legislative action being framed?
Very, very important. It's an area that I've worked in for many, many years. Worked with the Customs Office, got legislation passed a long time ago that allows customs officials to seize counterfeit goods coming into the country. In the old days, they had to just turn it away. They couldn't seize it, and it would just go around to another port or to another country and would perpetuate that piracy, that copyright theft. That's helped, but today the problem has gotten of much greater magnitude. First of all, more and more countries are manufacturing counterfeit CDs, DVDs, and so on. But of even greater concern is that much of it now is not even tangible. It's going across the internet in ways that you can't have a customs examiner seize it at the port. And recent studies have said that one quarter of all international internet traffic is basically involved in infringing on other people's intellectual property rights. So they're primarily their copyright rights, but sometimes their trademark rights as well. And that's a staggering, that's not 1/4 of goods, not 1/4 of music sales over the internet. It's 1/4 of all the communications of an international nature going through the internet involves somebody stealing somebody else's movies, music, software, books, video games, you name it. If it's digitizable, it is vulnerable, and that takes the whole incentive out of creativity that we rely on as one of the bases for our free enterprise system. So we have legislation in mind, and we also are holding hearings. We're going to hold a hearing on what are called rogue websites. Basically, oftentimes that has a wide definition, but a characteristic of it would be someone posing as a legitimate business, looking exactly like the real thing, and you can buy it online, download it, and they may be located anywhere in the world. The customer doesn't know that. They think they're dealing with a legitimate business. They're actually being sold something that is effectively stolen from the legitimate owner of the business. And what kind of tools can we use? We need to have much more international cooperation, and we need to continue the message to countries like China and Russia that these are countries with tremendously creative people. And if they don't devise a system in their country to protect intellectual property rights of Americans and others who are trying to do business around the world and seeing their property stolen, they'll never become more than just that, you know, a country where they develop things based upon ideas, technologies stolen from elsewhere, and not, if they can't reward and protect their own citizens and others, they're going to miss out on the potential that they have of the creativity in their own country.
Gautam Nagesh.
Now, two notes. That study you referred to with 25% of the traffic, I believe that was commissioned by NBC Universal, and I'm familiar with it. But I did want to ask, there are concerns that with customs actions and DHS, that the domain name seizures are taking place without adequate review, and that there is some concern that if the government is given this unilateral control ability to take down domains that they feel are rogue, that this can be abused potentially for reasons other than copyright infringement. How would you react to that?
Well, absolutely. We don't want to be Egypt, nor do we, you know, when you talk about cybersecurity, a broader issue that goes beyond theft to concerns about what can be done to harm the function of the internet itself. We don't want to give government so much power that they have a kill switch or something like that. And then narrowing that down to individual domains, we need to be very careful that we're doing it in a way where due process is properly followed. So again, there have been some criticism of the Senate legislation geared at that. We're not going to start with what the Senate's done. We're going to start by taking a careful, fresh look at this and making sure that we can utilize a judicial system or adapt that judicial system to fairly deal with these issues. We're also going to hold a hearing on ICANN and some of its proposals, which is going to, you know, in fact, it's more than a proposal. It's a plan that they're in the process of implementing to dramatically expand the number of end domains that are available, which could complicate immensely the ability of people to protect their intellectual property rights. So we want to ask them some really pointed and tough questions about that, and also hear their ideas about why they think that is necessary and important to do.
One other note on that, President Obama met with, obviously, the Chinese president when he was here recently, and they discussed intellectual property enforcement. The president only received a very small concession, which was that the Chinese government itself would take care to avoid purchasing pirated software. What can be done to convey the importance of this issue to the Chinas and the Russias that pose a problem?
Well, that is important. If China actually does that, which we'll wait and see if they do, that would be a good first step, because if you are imposing that ethic on the people who are charged with enforcing the laws in China, then they might have a greater appreciation for the rampant amount of piracy that's taking place in China. Far worse than, I would say, any other country in the world. Recently, Steve Ballmer, the CEO of Microsoft, came and talked to me and a few others and said that comparing China to Russia, which has a bad reputation itself, they believe that the rate, now China is a much more populous country than Russia, but the rate of internet theft based upon the number of computers in China compared to the number is 6 times as great in China as it is in Russia. And that worldwide, the piracy that's taking place is costing 40,000 to 60,000 American jobs. This from a company that has, I think, only about 88,000 jobs total in the United States. So if they could almost double, certainly increase by 50%, that one company's employment in this country by handling this problem, and we'll never completely handle it, but getting a better handle on it will create a lot of American jobs.
And finally, Congressman Goodlatte, net neutrality. The Energy and Commerce Committee is holding hearings on the issue of net neutrality. FCC is very active on this. What is your view of the government's role in net neutrality?
Well, I think that the Judiciary Committee has a very important role here. In fact, I and former Congressman Rick Boucher, who were the co-chairs of the Congressional Internet Caucus, I'm still the Republican co-chair in the House side, we introduced legislation almost a decade ago. We didn't call it net neutrality, we called it open access, but it was exactly the same thing, assuring that people getting access to the Internet, doing business on the Internet, have the opportunity to fairly compete, and that the people who control that access, primarily the Internet service providers, do so in a fair way. That is the essence of antitrust laws. And my concern about what the FCC has done is twofold. First of all, I do not believe that they have the legislative authority, the existing authority under the law, to essentially view the Internet from a common carrier status point of view and step in to regulate in this area. But secondly, and more importantly, for many of my friends who, as I do, believe in open access and support this regulatory approach with what the FCC is doing with net neutrality, I say to them, be careful what you ask for, because this is a massive new intrusion that could lead to far greater tentacles of regulation of the Internet than currently exists. One of the most dynamic things about the Internet, one of the most phenomenal things about how it has grown, has been its lack of regulation, its lack of excessive taxation, and that freedom has caused the Internet to become the dominant force in people's lives and the dominant force in the growth of our economy. And we don't want to lose that by turning over to a bureaucracy a regulatory process. Antitrust laws, as I said at the outset, relate to enforcing laws that are on the books to make sure that things are fair. We'll look at this from the standpoint of, do we need to tweak our antitrust laws to adapt to new situations? Do we need to make sure that our antitrust system is accessible to smaller businesses and individuals, because it can be very expensive to go through that process? But that kind of throw the book at the bad guy approach, as opposed to the government writing massive rules of the road for the Internet that the FCC wants to undertake, is, in my opinion, the far better way to go to assure open access to the Internet.
Representative Bob Goodlatte is chairman of the House Subcommittee on Intellectual Property and the Internet, as well as co-chairman of the Congressional Internet Caucus. Gautam Nagesh from the Hill newspaper, thank you both for being on the Communicators.
Thank you, Peter.